This episode, I'm joined by Adrian Nathan West to discuss the work of Hermann Berger. A warning for those of you who are sensitive to the topic of suicide, there is extensive discussion of it within this talk, so this might be one for you to avoid. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Nate West, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing the work of Hermann Berger, who was a pessimistic writer, novelist, very depressing. And the reason I'm talking to you is because you are, the primary translator into English, the only translator into English?
The only one. I believe there's a poet named Daniele Pantano who lives in Switzerland who I think is going to do the poems, but I think he's only going to do the poems. So in theory, I will continue doing as much of the fiction as I can find a publisher for.
Okay. And from yourself so far, though you have sent me two other things which I'll mention, we have Brenner, which is this small, very nice little book, which is sort of a prose-style autobiography of Berger. And then we have a book that I think is almost becoming infamous. Like, I made this tweet, which is how we got in contact, and I was surprised at the reaction to that tweet. I was like, why are so many people interested in this?
Yeah.
We have Tractatus Logico Suicidalist, on killing oneself. So I will just say before we get started, actually, the reason the way I came across Berger was I put out this tweet asking I wanted people to reply with the most bleak, depressing books they'd ever read. And a lot of them I already read because it's become like a hobby of mine to find the bleakest thing. But that one was very new at the time, so I must have had some follower who's really had their finger on the pulse. But I was like, wow, this Berger guy's really just gone to the end game. So before we get started, before we jump into Berger, tell us a bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why you translate this guy.
Sure. So I'm a writer and literary translator. I'm from the United States. I actually just moved back to the United States. So I lived in Spain for 9 years before that. And I've translated a pretty wide variety of work, a lot of it on commission, a lot of it things I've chosen myself. I always tell people, because people will sometimes say, oh, I trust the work of X and X translator. Well, that's good, but you should also see if you're interested in the book or not, because we also have to pay the bills. And sometimes we translate things that are not necessarily our favorites. Hermann Berger is an exception to that rule. Hermann Berger is one of my absolute favorites. So I'm a novelist myself as well. I wrote a book called My Father's Diet. I also have a book about pornography called Aesthetics of Degradation. I write some essays and criticism. But translation has been, for the past 10 years, what I do. Fundamentally, I work mainly from German and Spanish. I also do some Catalan. Hermann Berger, as I say, really a passion project. I think one of the strangest writers I've ever read, one of the most intricate prose stylists I've ever read. If you're a fan of synesthetic metaphors, if you're a fan of hypotaxis, he's somebody very special. Yeah.
Now, for the non-literary, technically minded, what are those two things that you just mentioned?
So synesthesia is essentially the mingling of different senses. And it's actually been studied, so it isn't something that people are just making up in these poetic fits of inspiration. It is a thing that actually happens to people when, for example, they see sounds or they hear smells. Nabokov was famously synesthetic. And one of the things they say about synesthetic people is that they tend to perceive that certain letters have a color or they have a certain sound to them. Whether Berger was a true synesthetic or whether he was doing it for effect, I have no idea, but I can say that it's an important part of his prose. And as far as hypotaxis, just the adding of clauses, the adding of additional clauses. So you get these extraordinarily long telescoping sentences in Berger. And of course, there's artistic justifications for that, but there are also personal aspects to it. I think this could be going a little bit far in my psychologizing, but Berger was manic depressive, and there are parts of his prose that are extremely manic feeling. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is as I do these interviews, the biography and the work of writers is usually not things you can take apart. Occasionally you can, but with Berger, it's it's absolutely emphatic that they are together. I mean, as you said, he is a manic depressive, which is like, I don't mean to belittle it, like that's an understatement in a way. Reading his work,
Yes.
is something. I mean, just to throw in a few figures, because this is like the stuff I read all the time. You have someone like Chiron, who I think is very romantic. You have someone like Bernhard, who I feel is there's a lot of humor there. He's trying to work something out time and time again, all this repetition. There's Celine, who's dealing with the human condition. And with Berger, I mean, the reason it was so, the reason it took me so long to get through the Tractatus, I mean, other than the fact it's over 1,000 aphorisms on suicide, is that it's mortological.
Yes.
And so, I mean, just to draw that into his biography, what did his life look like? Because it didn't look nice from what I can gather in English.
Well, it's difficult to say because you have the life viewed from outside and you have the life viewed from within. From outside, he seems to have had a fairly conventional upbringing. He was from what I take to be a decently well-off family. His father was an insurance salesman. His mother was a housewife. His mother was from what was considered a city, which was St. Gallen. So this is, I think, about 60,000 people when she lived there or something like that. And his father was from the countryside. They lived in a small town called Menziken. Menziken, of course, is still there in the Aargau in Switzerland. And where things got strange for him were in these specific incidents in his life, which are recalled in Brenner. So he had, I guess, an inguinal hernia, which he was operated for when he was young, and associated that with his later impotence or his later genital problems. And then at another point, his parents were involved in what could be called, depending on your point of view, a cult or a religious community or a political organization, which was called Moral Rearmament. Moral Rearmament is interesting because it actually is the organization that eventually gave birth to Alcoholics Anonymous. Many of the Alcoholics Anonymous principles come from Moral Rearmament. But at any rate, for Berger, it was undeniably a cult. And he felt that its mores, and particularly its sexual mores, had deeply repressed him and again had caused these sexual problems in his life, which later led to severe neuroses, which later led to manic depression, and so on. So I don't know what sort of student he was in high school. I think in university, he was a good student. He studied architecture for 4 semesters, then switched to German literature, which he got a PhD in. He became a critic. He had several axes to grind with several people. So at one point, he was living with his wife in a pastor's house, and he was kicked out of that. And he wrote a novel about it called A Shot at the Pulpit because he was so aggravated at that. He had a huge bone to pick with the paper that ended up firing him. So there used to be a diagnosis from Kraepelin, which is no longer used in psychology, which is a querulous personality. And I think he had a little bit of that, he had very much a chip on his shoulder about a lot of things. And so anyway, to continue with his life, at a certain point, his mania and his depression seemed to have become very out of hand, and his wife left. He says in Brenner that they left. She and his children left like rats from a sinking ship, and so he was living in essentially the attic room of this old castle owned by a distinguished Swiss historian. And he wrote Brenner there. He wrote Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis there, and then he killed himself. So yeah, that's the story in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And sort of like one of maybe the darkest jokes of a writer's biography. I mean, when I was reading about him, what I could find, there's this fact that he writes a book called Tractatus Logico-Suicidalis on killing oneself, and his publishers think this is a joke. But actually, I mean, reading it, I at the start I thought, yeah, maybe you could see this as like some ironic long satire, and then by the end you think, no, I mean, they should have probably been worried about this guy.
Yeah.
And just this kind of irony of like, he publishes this, what is really a Tractatus on suicide, and then kills himself. And it's like, well, yeah, like I don't mean to be crude about it, but it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there was something, but even before he published this was, I mean, of course he's a depressive, but was suicide in the sense that he's writing about it there, like in the mortological sense. So this sense of mortology, of I guess mortality also. But the book is almost surgical at times. It's like it talks about the human like it's a cadaver. Is this something that sort of haunted his life, before he put this together?
Certainly. So if I remember correctly, his initial depression started when he was doing his military service. So I think in Switzerland, military service is compulsory, maybe a year of it or something like that. He absolutely detested military service, and it made him a lifelong pacifist, although he was fairly conservative, I think, politically. And as I say, I believe there was a sort of issue there where he had to come home or something like that at one point. And I do know that fairly early death was an obsession of his. So I'm not sure if I say this in one of the introductions, but he went on a road trip at one point with a friend, and I believe this is when he was about 23. And he said to his friend something to the effect that, well, death is the only real issue in life. It's the only real question in life, or the only thing worth thinking about. So certainly from very early, and of course in his fiction, it's present from the very beginning. So it is true that there are some very early stories that don't deal with it so explicitly. But by the time he publishes his first novel, Shilton is only about death, exclusively about death. So
the reason you decided to translate him, I mean, obviously you have this personal interest. Some agreement there from yourself?
I don't know. I don't necessarily look for writers who think the same things that I do when I want to translate. Often it's simply people that I find unique or special. Of course, I have my preoccupations with these issues as well. But in the case of Berger, it really was a bit more simple. It was that I found his work because there's an old TV show called The Literary Quartet that was on German television. And it was hosted by a man named Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, who was known as the literature pope in Germany. And Reich-Ranitzky knew Berger pretty well, and he was something of a champion for Berger. And they were talking about him, and I just overheard it, and I thought, well, this sounds fascinating. And Reich-Ranitzky was a very belligerent man, and he was arguing with the people on his show because one of them said, oh, well, he's basically just like Thomas Bernhardt. And Reich-Ranitzky throws his hands in the air and starts screaming, says, how can you say that you find him unreadable in this and this and this? And then you also say he's like Thomas Bernhardt. And as Reich-Ranitzky fulminated about him, I thought, well, this looks interesting. And so I was able to get a copy of The Laughter Artist first, the story that I sent you, and it was one of the most bizarre things I've ever read. And so then I just got a used copy of Brenner, which I read on a train, and Brenner for me was completely different from The Laughter Artist, but at its peaks was some of the most beautiful prose I'd ever read, some of the most complex metaphorics I'd ever read. And Berger's really not well known. He's not even well known in the German-speaking world. And I just thought, well, somebody has to do this. So.
So we mentioned Bernhard there, who I think, especially in the Tractatus, I mean, Berger is explicitly references Bernhard multiple times. There's also the influence of Houdini, who I want to get to because I think that's an important aspect. But in terms of his lineage, in terms of who it is who's influencing, I believe Porcelain is the other big figure, but is there any others so he's sort of drawing on?
So he has fairly classical tastes for a German language writer. He, as I said, he did his doctorate in German literature. And but as far as the people that he cites and the people who seem most important to him, so I know that Günter Grass was incredibly important to him as a prose stylist, I think, more than because of Grass's themes. So one of the things that Berger would do, because he was megalomaniacal and he was extremely ambitious, and he would take writers and take chunks of their prose that he admired, and it would sort of take a sentence and write his own sentence, but following the exact same structure. And he did that with Grass. He did it with Bernhard. He did it with Kafka. Ingeborg Bachmann was incredibly important for him. If I'm not mistaken, they met in Switzerland at one point. And she's a very significant writer for him who comes up a lot in a book of his called The Artificial Mother. Theodor Fontana is quite important for him. Gottfried Benn, whom he mentions in Brenner a few times. So he was, Berger started as a poet. So I do think that German language poetry had a big influence on him as well. And of course, he knew Swiss regional literature well. So there are writers who are not so well known, but who do show up in his work. And then, of course, one that he cites in Tractatus, whom I have to plug here because his book is absolutely wonderful. And that is Fritz Zorn, whose book is called Mars. Mm-hmm. So Fritz Zorn was a wild character.
Is he translated?
He is translated. So the book was translated, I believe, in the 70s or something like that. I think it's out of print, but I don't think it's very difficult to find copies of it. So Berger mentions Fritz Zorn because of Zorn's profound hatefulness toward not only toward Switzerland, but I think you could say toward the world at the point at which Fritz Zorn receives his cancer diagnosis. So Zorn was convinced that, and it's actually kind of a funny thing. So his real name was Fritz Angst. So Angst is like fear or angst in German, but he changed his name to Fritz Zorn, and Zorn is rage. And I think for him, this was this phoenix-like transformation as he tried to confront the issue of his cancer. Well, what happened with Fritz Zorn, he was from a very wealthy family, a very wealthy bourgeois family. And he says he felt that he could never really be interested in anything. And at a certain point, he concludes that he could never be interested in anything because his sexual passion was stifled. And his sexual passion was stifled because he was a bourgeois. And because that instinct was turned inward, he had a psychosomatic cancer. And it was his parents' fault and it was society's fault. And he hated all of them. And he got it all out in his book. And it's a fantastic, very grim, but at the same time very funny book.
What year was that?
That's a good question. It must have been in the mid 70s, I believe.
Sounds like he read a lot of Wilhelm Reich, to be honest.
Well, and it's funny because he must have this in common also with Berger. So one thing with Berger is that at a point when neurology was starting to affect the way we interpreted psychology and so on and so forth, this was a moment when Berger adopted a very strict Freudian view of psychology and said, this is absolutely it. All of my neuroses come from my mother, and so on.
So, I mean, that's he doesn't beat around the bush with this impotence, with having problems there, and it's odd that they both find this a key thing. What is it? I guess to focus on Berger, what is it for him to be impotent?
Well, so he had children, so at some point the problem must have been at least partly solved. But I think that with Berger, well, there are a couple of matters. Fundamentally, what Fritz Zorn says is that all shame is actually a sexual shame. Okay. And I think that Berger has that sensation as well. I think there was a profound wound in Berger. And I think that at some point he decided, and I do think it is a question of deciding and not only of interpreting, that his wound also was a sexual wound, and that it was a sexual wound that had been caused by his mother. And where it really comes to the fore is in a book that I'm hoping to translate. I've translated a bit of it, but I need to find a publisher for it, called The Artificial Mother. So The Artificial Mother is a wonderful book in which a professor undergoes something more or less that's a parody of something that did happen to Berger, where he has a very miserable job and he loses that miserable job. And at the same time, he's afflicted by what he calls genital migraines. And so because of these genital migraines, he decides to undergo a type of therapy that is called the artificial mother therapy, in which he goes into these caves in the mountains in Switzerland. And a psychologist tells him that the origin of his problems is his mother. And so the mother actually has to be extracted from the brain, and a new artificial mother has to be placed there who will nurture him and who will encourage his sexual feelings. And for example, at one point, he concludes that his impotence has to do with a fear of the vagina. And so he selects as an ideal mate a woman who's a newscaster because she only exists from the waist up. And so it's thoroughly perverse, but I also think it's quite magical, and of course it's very funny.
I mean, this is the thing with Berger's plots. Obviously, I haven't read too many, but the one you just mentioned, Brenner itself. I mean, this is a guy just wrapped around. He's coated in cigar smoke. We'll get to this notion of cigars. But there's one that was also mentioned by you in an introduction where I think so I haven't read this, but just the plot alone that you mentioned, I was like, that is the most unhinged idea for some reason. It's one, I believe, where a young boy is turned into a hockey puck and then dragged into hell. I mean, that as an idea just put me on edge. I was like, that's that hasn't come from a healthy mind. Like it's not it's not a sort of a natural idea. Like something, I don't know.
Well, and I think there's an oniric quality there, which is present often in Berger. So when you read Brenner, he talks about this woman that he calls the the naval woman or something like that he has these dreams about, and she drags him down into this dark, steamy cave where she does these sort of sexual things with him. And at one point he's painting a picture, and the picture has this orifice that leads to hell in it. And I think that he has a lot of pit type imagery in his work. And I think that there is this obsession with something that probably was a physical sensation that he had encountered in dreams or something, of being spirited away or storied away. And in some cases, you have a positive version of that, which is like with this woman that he calls the naval woman. And in some cases, you have the negative version of that, which is, in the Tractatus, he talks about the dark pit or the black hole or something like that he sequestered into.
Something else to touch on there that you mentioned this, so this artificial mother, this notion of artificiality seems to be key. So I was trying to remember, I was just looking there because I remembered that there was an importance in the first sort of aphorism or quote from Tractatus is, there is no natural death. Yeah. And also I remember somewhere else Berger says that basically at a certain point in his life, he no longer was interested in what we consider reality. He says, that, I guess, it's not necessarily fiction, but like, I can't remember what word he uses, but he's more interested in pretend, in fantasy, in illusion. That interests him more. So this is someone who, I wonder if for Berger, perhaps you could comment on this. What even is reality? Can we even get there? Is that something we can get to?
Well, I think that it's possible that one can, but he sort of says, as you say, that he's not really so interested in it. So I'm looking for this quote here. So if I can quote you from Brenner, he's talking about his life, and his life is one that he's not satisfied with. He has these other alternative lives that he dreams up in the book. And at one point he's talking about a label for a place called Villa Malaga, which made sweet wine. It was Spanish wine, but it was bottled in Switzerland. And he's in love with the label, and he gives this incredibly elaborate description of the building. And he says at one point, and I'm going to read a short passage, "Happily, I would have lived in those days, a salesman beside my great-grandfather in the Waldau, a dealer in raw tobacco, brown gold. In my lowermost depths, I am captivated by the specter of risk, of hitting the big one. I ever was, still am, and shall always remain, at least for another 2 or 3 years, a grifter, and magic permits me to juggle. Look close and you will see it. With the certainty of my own death, this alone makes it bearable and explains my penchant for the market stall, for the circension, for the illusory, for the do as I do imagination, where you follow the magician's movements, but something quite different emerges." And so one of his friends says in a volume of memorial writings on him that his feeling about Hermann Berger was that he was profoundly bored. And so he, as a contrast to that boredom, he develops this incredibly detailed interest in certain things, or these extremely complex fascinations. And so magic, the circus, artificiality, trickery, those, he says, interest him more than life.
I think when I was reading Berger, because there is such a textual connection to Bernhard, I was trying to figure out what is it that what's the leap that's being made. And there's a quote by Bernhard where he says that the reason, this is a paraphrase, I can't remember it exactly, but he says the reason he hasn't killed himself is because life still intrigues him. And I think, as you've said there, the leap is Berger he's suicidally bored. He's just completely not interested, which leads me to the question of, maybe that's why this writing comes across with this odd prose, with this synesthesia, as you said, with this almost unhinged feeling. This is someone who's writing who, I don't know, it's writing that just has no reason for it in a way. Why do you think he wrote?
Well, there are probably good reasons and there are probably bad reasons. Well, from a certain point of view, at any rate. So I think the bad reason would be that he did have these megalomaniacal tendencies, and he had an idea, and he shares this, in fact, with Bernhard, although in English, I think fewer people know this. He wanted to beat the other people, he wanted to win. And there's a wonderful story of Thomas Bernhard where the great Austrian writer Hamito von Dorer dies, and Bernhard is at his real estate agent's house, who is also his neighbor. and he sees it on TV. And Bernhard jumps up and he starts dancing around the living room saying, "I'm number one, I'm number one." And, there are quotes from Berger where he says, well, when so-and-so dies, we'll have Max Frisch, so I'll be number two in Switzerland after this. So he certainly was obsessed with these things. But I also do think that he was a very meticulous artist. And I do think that he was an artist by vocation, in the same way that he could develop the fascination that he had with bobsledding, with sports cars, with certain types of art. I think that he was able to re-experience those things through his own literary art. And I think that sufficed for him for a while.
And we should, to add in, this key element in a way that he grows up in a cigar family. So each chapter from Brenner is named after a cigar brand, I believe, and then also as you said, the sports car plays a role in the sense that once he's made this decision to end his life, why do I need savings? Or, I'll buy a Ferrari because I'm not going to be there anymore, which is a really bleak joke, but it's quite a good one. So he grows up, sort of like Bernhard as well, grows up in really an extensive bourgeoisie setting. You've already mentioned this, but
that's true. So in Brenner, he does exaggerate his connections to the cigar industry. In fact, his grandfather was an innkeeper. He did have distant relatives that were working in the cigar business, but most of his information he got from a friend whose name was Kaspar Williger. And Williger did take him to these cigar fairs, and because Berger was quite exhaustive, he did learn, I think, everything you sort of can learn about them. But much of his writing about cigars is almost metatextual. So he's often almost pastiching a quite wonderful book in German, which is called Im blauen Dunst. So like in blue smoke, and then also this book called the Tobacco Encyclopedia. And pastiche is an important part of Berger's work in general. But as I say, he did have that quite close association with an important cigar person. He had distant relatives in the cigar industry, and he smoked a lot of fucking cigars. So
I was going to say, if you look up pictures of him, I don't think there's maybe one or two without a cigar.
Yeah.
When you say he smoked a lot, it seems pretty constant. It seems like a key, almost like material cornerstone of his life was to be smoking a cigar.
So you occasionally see him with a cigarette, and it reminds me of, and he talks badly about cigarette smokers in Brenner. It reminds me of this wonderful quote from Martin Amis. There was an interview with him where they see him and he has a vape pen, and he says to the interviewer, "It's something to do between cigarettes." And I think for Berger, smoking cigarettes must have been something to do between cigars, but he smoked as many as 30 a day, supposedly.
30 cigars?
Yeah, which it doesn't seem as though there's time for that, but I guess some of them must have been panatellas, which are very thin or something.
A good normal sized cigar is at least 30 minutes to an hour.
So
he's constantly smoking.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything more to it than enjoyment? Do you think there was? I think when I think of smoking, one of my sort of favorite appreciations of smoking, especially tobacco, nicotine, is from Ernst Junger, who says that smoking and nicotine are the perfect drug because they just pass time. There's no other reason for them, and they're perfect for that. For you can't just, I used to think this when I go to the pub, I want to go stand outside, but I can't just stand outside and do nothing. So the cigarette is perfect for that. Do you think maybe that's what it was for Berger? I guess today I'll just keep smoking cigars because that means it passes the time.
Well, I'm sure that there was a part of it that was a compulsion, but there is also an element related to time. So there's there's another wonderful quote from Brenner, if I can read you another passage, where he says, he's talking about tobacco, and he says that the material, he's talking about tobacco, but he also calls the book itself his tobacco leaves, so what he's typing on, he calls his tobacco leaves. And he says that the material dissolves into fugitive clouds instead of returning to the soil is the root of my fascination with the tobacconist's calling. I smoke my childhood to its end, grateful to the indulgent reader who affords me company in the meanwhile, for the arid grace of a dear cigar is doubled when it's shared. I have to plug myself there because there was a complex joke in German, and so arid grace of a dear cigar is actually I've rearranged the same letters for those phrases to try to imitate that thing in German. But at any rate, he says more or less, he is smoking his life away. He's quite conscious of that, and he views what he's doing, I think the writing as well as the smoking, as a process of combustion.
But oddly seems to be a lot of meaning then in his life. There seems to be reasons.
Yeah.
Seems to be a rationality. So he's not a nihilist. He doesn't seem like a nihilist.
It's curious. I think that there are perhaps these sort of islands of meaning floating in the nothingness. But as I say, he also had this sort of querulous aspect. And so in his mind, well, he talks a lot, for example, in both books about the need for sexual satisfaction and perhaps you could even say his right to sexual satisfaction, and this idea that he could perhaps have been rescued from suicide if things had been better for him in that sense. And did he really think this? I don't know. It's impossible to say. I imagine, like most manic people, he probably thought it in the time that he was uttering it, and then probably didn't think it in a more rational moment.
So outside of that, you'd consider that delusional?
Well, I can't say, because if many people have killed themselves, has someone killed themselves from a lack of sexual affection? I'm sure people have, undoubtedly. Could the problem have been solved? Probably. But, and in fact, I mean, he was married, and I believe that he had a girlfriend that I don't know very much about, toward the end of his life. But these are women of flesh and blood who also have their own demands, and probably demands include things like, don't go buy a fucking Ferrari without telling me, or what, I don't know what specific issues they had. One thing that comes across reading about Berger is he must have been ungodly difficult to get along with. And he's clearly aware of that. At one point he quotes a woman who talks to him, and she says, this is actually a beautiful way that he turns this around. So he's complaining about his wife, and a friend says to him, but nobody could put up with that. And he says, yeah, but there's one person who has to, me. And so it's incredibly egotistical, but at the same time, it is also very touching because it is true.
But so I think this is your analysis of this sort of, if people have looked at Berger, there's an infamous quote, possibly, controversial quote coming up from Berger,
sure.
Which is along those same lines. And it's sort of, he understands his depression in a pretty meta way, in a sense, where he says that the trials of Auschwitz pale in comparison to what he suffered in his depression. Yep. You read this, you analyze this as someone, he's understanding that when you are in a deep depression, one of the things you try to do is to basically just push everyone away because you want to be on your own. You want to be like, let me be depressed on your own. And it seems like what you mentioned about, this quote with, I have to deal with myself, so don't worry about my wife, is much the same thing of saying almost the most biting, controversial thing you can to continue push yourself down into the pit and also just push everyone away.
There's certainly a truth to that. I think there's inevitably there's a very deep petulance and a very deep self-regard in a quote like that. So I think for the sake of readers, I will read what actually he says, just to discuss it. So what he's talking about is an experience at what he calls the Children's Home / Concentration Camp, which is called Amden. So his parents left him there because they went to a moral rearmament conference in a city called Gao I don't know if it's a city, but this is the town. This is where the hotel was, in Montreux. And while he was there, a mean little boy tormented him and made him kneel on rocks and scared him, and he thought he was going to die. And then he read the Struwwelpeter, which was terrifying. And so Berger says this. He says, that this is a concentration camp. And a friend of his who's a literary critic, he says in the book, his name is Adam Nautilus Rauch. It says, Adam Nautilus Rauch rebuked me for using the term concentration camp to describe the children's home in Amden. Whoever says such a thing has no idea what he's talking about. True, what I suffered through 2 years after the gruesome discoveries in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen cannot be compared to the Nazis' vast death and inferno machinery. True, the words concentration camp are so laden with specific atrocities that they reject employment as a metaphor. We ate no potato peel soup. No one tore out our gold teeth. Everything was quite simply much, much worse. To describe Amden as a children's concentration camp is an inadmissible understatement. If I'm taken off to the showers, I don't know what is happening to me, and once the gas streams in, the horror is over. But these weeks of solitary terror above the Walensee, indirectly perpetrated by moral rearmament, were endless, and the perversity of childhood savagery was that it could play out right under the eyes of the sisters in the cornets. The inmates of Auschwitz could appeal to no higher power. Their fate befell them without any semblance of justice. Murder behind the barbed wire was at least a certainty, straightforward like cancer, as opposed to the inconclusiveness of depression. Here I must respond to my friend and critic that Hermann Arbogast Brenner, which is his pseudonym in the book, is no historian and need not conceive of things in relative terms. His persuasiveness depends on mingling the materials the scholar keeps in different drawers. I do so in awareness of my right to subjectivity. And so, as I say, you can look at this quote in different ways. You can look at it and just say, wow, this is a terrible person, which I think is a completely legitimate perspective. I think you also can look at it as somebody who has a lot of chutzpah and who is, as you mentioned earlier, striking out either to push people away or to simply try to express how deep his pain is, or in defense of a philosophical principle, which is this right to subjectivity. And I think all of those different perspectives are valid. Clearly, the statement is offensive. Clearly, Berger wants it to be offensive. Mm-hmm. What one does with that, whether one considers it art, I'm not the sort of person that would browbeat somebody into reading that a certain way. I think if somebody said, this is too much for me, this is offensive, I find that completely legitimate. Mm-hmm. And I think people's perspectives on those things are also determined by their background and many other things. But undoubtedly, the offense is there. It's on purpose, and it is to try to express a level of suffering that I think that he felt that nobody really listened to, that nobody really believed. Mm. Because, of course, from the outside, you'd say, well, what's your problem, actually? You're fine. You have a wife, you have kids, you write. Well, his wife had left him, but still he had a place to live. He had food. From the outside, everything is fine. And he wants to try to say, perhaps from the outside, it looks like this, but inside it's hell.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads to a big question. I mean, what is existence? What is it to exist for Berger? Is there anything redeemable there?
Right. So is there anything redeemable? Well, I think for him, what's redeemable are his fetishes, and by fetishes, I mean his magical fetish, his cigar fetish, even his fetish with certain images that recur over and over in his books. So there's a story he always tells in the books about stealing a kid's orange, and he takes the orange out and he eats it, but he has the peel, and he presents the peel in such a way that he's able to prove that he didn't actually steal the orange. And even though this is a silly story, it clearly has a very profound importance for Berger because it shows up repeatedly in all of his books as a moment when he seems to have perceived another way of existence that wasn't simply following the rules. And this must speak in some way, when you asked about his fascination with Harry Houdini, to what he did appreciate about Houdini. And I think what he did appreciate about Houdini was somehow skirting all of the requirements that existence places upon us.
It reminds me of a Wittgenstein quote where he says that the language for truth and the language for pretending are exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So Berger often finds himself in these areas of, I guess in relation to Houdini, it's like if the illusion, if the fantasy can be done to such an extent, then we can fully pretend, we can fully just fall into that complete illusory thing.
Sure, and this even has to do with some of the fictional challenges he sets himself. So Berger frequently uses a term in German, which is der schleifende Schnitt. So this in English is a glancing intersection. Mm. So essentially something like an asymptote, so you have something that comes and it comes so close to the truth that people can't tell them apart. And this was something that he always tries to do in his fiction. He always tries to. So, for example, in Diabelli, when he's recounting the stories of these different magicians' lives, well, many of these stories are invented. He takes real details and then he twists them around in accordance with his own psychological or artistic necessities. But he doesn't want you to know that. He wants you to think that it's true.
What was it like to spend so much time with Because of all the people in the world, you probably spent more time with Tractatus than anyone,
Yeah.
other than Berger himself.
Yeah.
What was it like to spend so much time with suicide in that sense? And what do you then think in relation to what we've spoken about with this, Houdini sort of escape or little tricks with the truth? The notion of that existence might not even be redeemable. What was suicide for Berger, and what was it like to spend so much time with that Bergerian view of suicide?
Well, oddly, I think that it was invigorating to translate the book. I didn't find it a particularly depressing book to translate, in contrast to something like a book that I did called When the Time Comes by Josef Winkler, where really I started to feel very, very grim at a certain point doing Winkler. Now, I think Winkler's a wonderful writer, but the book is really, really dark, and it just started to make me feel a bit. Well, I started to feel that darkness inside myself. The thing with Berger is that I think his creations are quite ingenious. I think he is a very funny writer, and I think that there is always this aspect of exaggeration with him that I don't want to say that it makes me take it less seriously, but it doesn't hit me as hard because it is funny. It is so exaggerated. I mean, the idea, it's one thing to say, I defend a person's right to commit suicide. It's another thing to say, I want to commit suicide. It's a very different thing to defend suicide as actually the noble thing, the highest expression of the human intellect, or the only rational choice for a person to make. A person who's willing to make those arguments and to really stand on them, I can't help but admire it, even if it's, it's not necessarily my perspective, but, and of course, I also do find it funny. I'm quite interested actually in humor and the philosophy of humor. And there's a theory of humor called benign boundary violation theory. Okay. And so the idea is that we tend to laugh at things that violate boundaries, but they have to be a benign violation. And so in the sense that if I, for example, if I sort of make a joke about you being bald, and it doesn't bother you, you don't take it personally, then this can be a benign violation. Whereas let's say that I make a racist joke and your wife is Arab, that's not a benign violation and you don't think that it's funny. And I think vis-a-vis humor related to death, I probably have a lot of leeway for what I would consider to be a benign violation. So I think the joke can get pretty dark and I'll still find it entertaining.
I don't know where I'd find a genuine violation. That might just be being British. We don't really.
Sure.
There's no extent to how bad the jokes can get. But do you think that's how Berger would want, I guess specifically the Tractatus to be read, is with a certain at arm's reach humor?
This is a difficult question to answer because I have no idea really if Berger even really understood that he had readers. I know that in an abstract sense that he did. I know that he wanted his books to be well reviewed. He participated in the Ingeborg Bachmann prizes, for example, which is a sort of public or semi-public reading in Austria. And obviously he wanted to win. He did win one year. So all of this suggests that he's a normal author, but I actually think at the moment of putting the pen to paper, I don't think the reader ever crosses his mind. Or I could be wrong about that, but I simply don't have that feeling, among other things, because in his work, and one of the reasons why he's not better known in the German-speaking world, there is so much that's so incredibly abstruse. And these are things that in my translation of Brenner, I smooth out often, or I try to make them a little bit more available for the reader. But even if you know German, if you sit down with Brenner, it's a quite impenetrable text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So was this how he made his money, his living, writing?
So he made his living. He did some teaching, and he also was a critic for a while. Toward the end of his life, I think he did make enough money as a writer. But again, toward the end of his life, he also said, there's no more point in squirreling it away. So, it was evident, I think, to everyone, or I don't know if everyone, but it was evident, at least to him, his landlord, and other people in his life, that he wasn't there for the duration.
He taught? What ages did he teach?
University. Okay. Yeah. So he was a kind of My understanding is that his situation was quite a bit like the situation of present day university adjuncts, where he was exploited and underpaid, and yeah,
Got work where he could,
yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. No wonder he's so miserable.
yeah, yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Berger that we haven't touched on so far?
I don't think so. Nothing occurs to me. Read him. That's what I would tell people. Read him. He's really great.
Where would you advise people to begin? Of course, in English, we do only have these two
Yeah,
books,
yeah.
right?
We have these two. So as you know, I've sent you the story Diabelli. That book will be published either in late 2024 or early 2025. I believe that it's the archetypal Berger text, and it will be included with three other stories. Two that it was originally published with, maybe around, I want to say 1979, although I'm not sure if I have that date right. And then one that was never published, that was published posthumously, that he wrote toward the end of his life. I think those are probably the best introduction to Berger. Of course, Brenner, I think, is a wonderful book, and probably for me is the peak of, or him at his peak abilities. But it is a book that you have to be patient with, and you have to be willing to take some time and to probably look up some words and things like that I'm not sure if contemporary readers are particularly inclined to.
I would probably say, just from reading the three, I'd probably say Diabelli. I mean, I've only gone through it once, but I did feel that it's this like really strong one. It's quite short as well.
Yeah, if you want to know who he is, I think that who he is and what he writes like, I think Diabelli is definitely the best introduction.
Are you planning on translating more?
I'd love to do everything. The novels are difficult. I need to find the right publisher for them. And of course, one of the things people don't see from outside, if they don't work in publishing is an industry that's governed by a lot of strange taboos and superstitions that can be very hard to break through. So most publishers don't want to publish anyone who's dead. Most publishers don't want to publish a book by somebody who's been published by another publisher. And there are all these other sort of bizarre rules to it that make it quite difficult. So I don't think that Archipelago will do any more Hermann Berger. So I need to find someone else for the novels. And the situation is, I think that Wakefield is enthusiastic about him, but Wakefield tends to publish shorter books. And so, for example, his novel Shilton, which is wonderful, but Shilton is probably 400 pages. So I would need to try to find someone else. At the very least, I would like to do The Artificial Mother. I've already done probably 40 or 50 pages of it, and it's not too long. It's about 220. So I'll keep my fingers crossed that I can maybe convince Wakefield to do it as well.
Okay. And your own work we can find at, what's your website is
anathanwest.com.
Anathanwest.com, where we can find your own fiction as well as your book on degradation.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? What are you translating next? I guess is the majority of your work not just unfortunately just pay the bills?
I don't know if it's a majority. It could be about half and half, although I'm not certain. As far as projects that I'm excited about that are coming out, there's a wonderful book that should be out next year by a Venezuelan writer who lives in the U.S. He's lived in the U.S. since the 80s, named Miguel Gomez. So Miguel's book is called Portrait of a Gentleman. It is a trilogy. I would describe it as a sort of very erudite Latin American Philip Roth. It's very funny. It's very horny. It has a lot of fun multilingual jokes and things like that in it. It was a great pleasure to translate, and Miguel's a writer I admire a lot. That's probably the one that I'm most excited about that's upcoming. I've just done 2 retranslations of 2 of Alejo Carpentier's best known books, Explosion in a Cathedral and The Lost Steps. Explosion in the Cathedral, I think, especially, is a pretty special piece of work. I would be patting my own back, but whatever, it's a situation. And then the big thing for me is the next novel. So I'm supposed to actually turn it into my agent in the next month or so. So that's really what I've been focusing most of my energies on.
Can I ask what that's about?
You can. So it's one of the things as a writer I want to do is not repeat myself. And so my first book, My Father's Diet, is first person. It has a very limited cast of characters. It's very introspective. And so I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do a large novel with multiple conflicts, multiple characters. In the case of this one, the most significant thread in it is dementia, but it has a character who's working in a children's mental hospital in the United States, so it's talking about that. It has a character who's a sommelier, so it talks about wine. It has a character who's an adolescent, so it talks somewhat about contemporary American adolescent culture. But as I say, the main theme is dementia.
Mm, mm. Wow. And which publisher? Who's that coming out with?
Whoever pays the most money and offers the best terms. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's always the way. Well,
yeah.
I'll be sure to put links for your own website in the description below,
Great.
as well as to both burger books. But I think that seems to be a good place to finish up. So
Perfect.
Nate Wentz, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.